On the morning of September 15th, 1925, in a small town outside Boston, I woke to the sound of rain tapping against glass, like impatient fingers counting down my remaining hours of freedom. At 23, with nothing but the clothes in my suitcase and the weight of memories from a life I shouldn't remember, I traced the familiar contours of the wedding band that would soon encircle my finger like a shackle. When I caught my sister's reflection in the mirror, her smile sharp as she schemed to push me toward the cruel man she'd escaped, I heard her thoughts as clearly as if she'd spoken them aloud. My newfound ability to hear others' minds wasn't a blessing. It was a weapon of survival in a game I'd already lost once before. This is the story of how a second chance at life taught me that freedom isn't given, it's taken. Subscribe now to discover how I rewrote my destiny in a time when women were expected to serve, not succeed. I died on my 35th birthday, watching my husband count the inheritance money while the doctor pronounced pneumonia as the cause. In truth, it was years of exhaustion, malnutrition, and a broken spirit that killed me. That, and Edward Thompson's refusal to call for medical help until it was far too late. My last thought, as darkness claimed me, was simple. I wish I'd left when I had the chance. Then I opened my eyes to sunlight, streaming through familiar lace curtains in my childhood bedroom. My hands smooth and unwrinkled, my lungs clear and strong. September 15th, 1925, my wedding day, 12 years before my death. I was back at the beginning. "Susan, Mother says to stop dawdling." My sister Margaret's voice carried through the door, just as impatient as I remembered. I stared at my reflection, hardly believing the face that looked back at me. No gray streaking my chestnut hair, no premature lines etching my face. I was 23 again, unmarked by the decade of silent suffering that awaited me. That's when I first heard it, a whisper that wasn't spoken aloud. "She looks nervous." Good. The Thompsons will take her off our hands, and I'll have Mother and Father's attention all to myself again. I whirled around, but Margaret was already walking away, her footsteps retreating down the hall. Her lips hadn't moved. Somehow, I was hearing her thoughts. I pressed my fingers against my temples, wondering if grief or illness had followed me from my past life. But the voice was clear as a bell, unmistakably Margaret's spiteful tone, though more honest than she'd ever been to my face. I steadied myself against the dressing table. In my first life, I'd been naive enough to believe my sister cared for me, that she genuinely thought Edward Thompson was a good match. I'd trusted her guidance when she pushed me toward him and steered our pretty neighbor Celia toward his kind-hearted cousin James. What a fool I'd been. "Susan!" This time it was my mother's voice, sharp with warning. "The Thompsons will be here any minute." The Thompsons. My stomach churned at the memory of Edward's cold eyes, his meticulous ledgers where he recorded every cent spent on my maintenance, his family's grand house where I'd been little more than an unpaid servant until the day I died. I could hear my mother's footsteps on the stairs now, her mind projecting clear as day. If we don't secure this match, John Carter will withdraw his investment in Richard's business. Susan needs to do her part for this family. So that was it, the real reason behind the rush to marry me off to Edward Thompson. My father's struggling textile business needed John Thompson's money. I was the collateral. Knowledge is power, and in that moment, I felt a surge of it coursing through me. This gift, this ability to hear thoughts, might be my salvation. I wouldn't waste my second chance. When my mother burst into the room, I was already dressed in my wedding attire. A cream-colored dress with delicate lace at the collar. Modest, unassuming, perfect for a bride being traded like a business transaction. "You look acceptable," Mother said, adjusting my collar. In her mind, thank goodness she's finally taking some responsibility. A girl with her plain looks should be grateful for any match, let alone a Thompson. I bit back the retort that rose to my lips. Let her think I was docile. Let them all think it. I had survived 12 years of Edward Thompson's coldness once before. I could endure a few hours of pretense now. The Thompsons arrived precisely at noon, John and Martha Thompson leading the way into our parlor, followed by their son Edward and nephew James. In my first life, I'd barely registered James, too consumed by anxiety over Edward's critical gaze. Now I noted his kind eyes, the way he offered a gentle smile to our maid when she took his coat, how he carried a small book in his pocket rather than a ledger like his cousin. "The brides-to-be look lovely," Martha Thompson announced, her pinched face betraying nothing of her thoughts. "The Evans girls are hardly what I'd hoped for, but at least they're from decent family lines. Edward needs a wife who won't embarrass us, and Susan Evans will do." Margaret practically preened under the attention, stepping close to James and sliding her arm through his. "James and I are so looking forward to the ceremony next week. Aren't we, dear?" James nodded politely, but his thoughts revealed his discomfort. "She's squeezing my arm too tight. I wish Father hadn't arranged this. She seems calculating." Edward approached me with a stiff bow. "Miss Evans." "Mr. Thompson," I replied, forcing my voice to remain steady. His thoughts were exactly as I expected. "Father says she comes with $500. Hardly worth the trouble, but a man needs a wife to manage the household. She'll do. Not she's beautiful or I hope she'll be happy. Just she'll do. Like I was a horse being evaluated at auction." "Let's discuss the final arrangements," my father suggested, leading John Thompson toward his study. The mothers followed, leaving us young people in the parlor with the maid hovering nearby as chaperone. Margaret immediately launched into detailed descriptions of her trousseau, clinging to James's arm while he nodded politely. Edward turned to me, his expression calculating. "I trust you have domestic skills, Miss Evans? My household runs on strict schedules. In my first life, I'd stammered assurances of my competence. This time, I met his gaze directly. "I manage quite well, Mr. Thompson. And you? Do you have skills beyond counting your father's money?" His eyes widened fractionally, a flash of anger crossing his features before he controlled it. "I'm a businessman, Miss Evans. I deal in results, not pleasantries. How fortunate, then, that you're marrying me for my domestic skills rather than my conversation." I smiled sweetly while his thoughts raged. Impertinent. Father didn't mention she had a sharp tongue. I'll have to break her of that habit quickly. Margaret shot me a warning glance. "What is Susan doing? She'll ruin everything." I excused myself to fetch refreshments, needing a moment alone to think. In the kitchen, I pressed my hands against the cool countertop and took a deep breath. My first instinct was to run, to pack a bag and flee before I could be forced into marriage with Edward. But where would I go? A woman alone in 1925, with no money, no references, no support? The world was not kind to such women. No, I needed a plan. Something better than blind escape. This time, I would use what I knew of the future and this new ability to hear thoughts to my advantage. When I returned with the tea tray, I'd composed myself. For the remainder of the visit, I played my part perfectly, demure, accommodating, exactly what Edward and his family expected. All the while, I listened to their thoughts, gathering information like ammunition. I learned that Edward's business was struggling more than anyone knew, that James secretly wrote poetry and dreamed of living in New York, that Martha Thompson despised her husband but stayed for the status his name provided. Each secret was a thread I could pull when needed. After the Thompsons departed, Margaret cornered me in the upstairs hallway, her eyes flashing. "What was that little performance about? Are you trying to sabotage your own marriage before it begins?" "I was merely getting acquainted with my future husband," I replied calmly. "Well, don't get too clever. Edward Thompson is a good match. Better than you deserve with your stubborn attitude. Not everyone gets to marry into money." I tilted my head, studying her. "And is James everything you hoped for?" A flicker of annoyance crossed her face. "James is perfectly adequate. He's the heir to his father's shipping interests, which is what matters." But her thoughts told a different story. "James is so dull compared to his cousin. If only I could have secured Edward instead. But Mother insisted Susan needed the stronger match to ensure Father's business arrangement. It's always about Susan." "I hope you'll be very happy together," I said, the irony lost on her. The wedding preparations continued at a frantic pace. My mother was determined to have everything perfect, though her definition of perfection aligned perfectly with Martha Thompson's preferences. My own wishes were irrelevant. I used the week to plan, to save what little money I could access, to memorize train schedules and map routes in my mind. At night, I lay awake thinking of the years ahead if I stayed. The cold bed, the endless labor, the careful accounting of every penny I spent, culminating in that final, painful winter when pneumonia would claim me while Edward calculated the cost of the doctor's visit. 3 days before the wedding, I received an unexpected visitor. Celia Wright, our pretty neighbor who, in my first life, had married James after Margaret manipulated her way to Edward. This time, Margaret had claimed James, leaving Celia unattached. "I brought some flowers from our garden for your wedding," she said, her smile genuine, though her thoughts revealed her pain. "I always thought James and I, but then Margaret caught his attention. I should be happy for them." "That's very kind," I replied, inviting her in for tea. "How have you been, Celia?" As we talked, I found myself increasingly drawn to her honest nature. Unlike my family or the Thompsons, what Celia thought aligned perfectly with what she said. There was no calculation, no scheming. "I'm moving to Philadelphia next month," she confided. "My aunt runs a bookshop there and has offered me a position. Mother thinks it's scandalous for me to work, but I'm looking forward to the independence. A bookshop in Philadelphia. Away from here, away from Edward." The possibility dangled before me like a lifeline. "That sounds wonderful," I said carefully. "Your aunt must be very progressive." Celia laughed. "Aunt Harriet marched for suffrage and never married. Mother calls her a lost cause, but she's the happiest woman I know." That night, I wrote a letter to Celia's aunt, explaining my situation in desperate but dignified terms. I had no claim on her kindness, but perhaps she might have suggestions for a woman seeking escape from an arranged marriage. I posted it early the next morning, though I held little hope of receiving a reply before my wedding day. 2 days before the wedding, Edward invited me to tour what would become our home, a tall, narrow townhouse in the affluent part of town. In my first life, I'd been impressed by its grandeur. Now I saw only the prison it would become. "You'll be responsible for the entire household," Edward explained as we walked through the rooms, his mother trailing behind us as chaperone. "I expect breakfast at 7 sharp, dinner at 6:30 precisely. The linens are changed on Mondays, silver polished on Tuesdays." The list of duties continued, each requirement spoken in the tone of someone addressing a new employee rather than a future wife. Martha Thompson's thoughts provided commentary. "She looks overwhelmed already. Edward should have chosen someone more robust, but at least she's listening carefully." "And this would be your domain," Edward concluded, showing me the kitchen with its modern appliances. "I trust you'll find everything satisfactory." "It's all very efficient," I replied. "You've thought of everything." "Of course I have. A household is a business, and I run my businesses with precision." "There's one thing I'm curious about," I said, keeping my tone light. "Will I have an allowance for household expenses, or will you manage all finances?" Edward frowned slightly. "I'll provide you with the exact amount needed for weekly groceries and supplies. Anything additional will need my approval, of course." "Of course," I echoed. "And personal items, clothing, books?" "Books?" His eyebrow raised. "You'll hardly have time for reading, Susan. As for clothing, I'll purchase what you need when necessary." In other words, I would have no money of my own, no independence whatsoever. Martha cleared her throat. "Edward believes in traditional household management. A wife shouldn't trouble herself with financial matters. The Evans girl is asking too many questions. Edward will need to be firm with her." "I'm simply trying to understand my role completely," I said, with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "I want to be the best wife possible." The day before the wedding, a letter arrived from Philadelphia. Celia's Aunt Harriet had responded. While my mother was occupied with final arrangements, I slipped upstairs to read it privately. "Dear Miss Evans, your letter moved me greatly. While I've never met you, any friend of my niece Celia is deserving of whatever assistance I can offer. The situation you describe is unfortunately common. Women traded in marriage like commodities, with no consideration for their happiness or fulfillment. If you truly wish to escape, there is a train departing for Philadelphia at 5:15 tomorrow morning. I can offer you temporary lodging and help finding suitable employment. It won't be easy. A woman alone faces many challenges, but you'll face them as your own person, not as someone's possession. The choice must be yours. If you decide to come, ask for me at Wright's Books on Market Street. With solidarity, Harriet Wright." I pressed the letter to my chest, tears threatening to spill. A choice. Someone was finally offering me a choice. That night, I packed a small bag with only essentials. A change of clothes, my mother's locket that would fetch a few dollars if needed, the $37 I'd managed to save. I hid the bag under my bed and lay awake, listening to the house settle around me and the thoughts of my slumbering family. My father was dreaming of business success, my mother of social advancement. Margaret's thoughts, even in sleep, circled around status and comparison. None of them were thinking of my happiness. At 4 a.m, I rose silently, dressed in my simplest traveling outfit, and retrieved my hidden bag. I left a letter on my dressing table, not apologizing, but explaining that I could not enter a loveless marriage to become an unpaid servant. They would be angry, embarrassed, but they would survive. My father would find another way to secure investment or face his business failures honestly. As I crept down the stairs, a floorboard creaked. I froze, heart pounding. Susan? Margaret stood at the top of the stairs, her hair in braids, looking younger than her 21 years. For once, her thoughts weren't calculating or competitive. They were confused, perhaps even concerned. "What are you doing? It's the middle of the night." I could have lied, made an excuse. Instead, I straightened my shoulders. "I'm leaving, Margaret. I'm not marrying Edward Thompson." "Don't be ridiculous. Where would you even go? You can't just leave. Think of the scandal. Think of Father's business." "I have thought of it. I've thought of nothing else. But I've also thought of the years ahead of me as Edward's wife, and I choose a different path." She descended the stairs, her expression hardening. "You're being selfish. This marriage isn't just about you. It's about our family's future. About my future, too. If she doesn't marry Edward, the agreement will fall apart. James's father might reconsider our match as well. Your future is your responsibility, Margaret, as mine is to me." I turned toward the door. She grabbed my arm. "I'll scream. I'll wake the whole house." I looked at her hand on my arm, then into her eyes. "No, you won't, because deep down, you know what Edward is. You pushed me toward him deliberately, relieved it wasn't you who had to marry him." Her grip loosened, her thoughts confirming my accusation. "How does she know?" "I know more than you think, sister. I know that you've always resented me for being born first, for taking attention you thought should be yours alone. I know you convinced Celia that James wasn't interested in her, clearing your path to him. I know that you're not marrying for love, but for status." Margaret stepped back, face pale. "How could you possibly—" "It doesn't matter how I know. What matters is that I'm leaving, and you're going to let me go. Live your life, Margaret. Marry James. Secure your social position. I wish you happiness. Truly I do. I meant it. Despite everything, she was my sister. And in my first life, she'd paid for her manipulation with years of unhappiness alongside a man who never loved her." She said nothing as I walked to the door, her thoughts a confused jumble of anger, fear, and something that might have been admiration. The pre-dawn air was cool against my face as I walked briskly to the train station, my heart lighter with each step. The station was nearly empty, just a few traveling businessmen and a family with sleepy children. I purchased my ticket to Philadelphia with shaking hands. As the train pulled away from the station, I watched my hometown recede, the steeple of the church where I was to be married that day growing smaller until it disappeared altogether. I thought of Edward waking to the news of my departure, of my parents' shock and embarrassment, of the gossip that would spread through town like wildfire. None of it mattered. I was free. The journey to Philadelphia took most of the day. I watched the landscape change through the window, farms giving way to increasing signs of industry and urban development. Other passengers came and went, their thoughts washing over me like background noise. Business concerns, family worries, mundane observations about the weather or the comfort of the seats. I found myself able to tune them out more effectively as the hours passed. The ability to hear thoughts, overwhelming at first, seemed to be something I could control with practice, a tool rather than a burden. Philadelphia's Broad Street station was a shock after the quiet of our small town. Thousands of people rushing in all directions, their thoughts a cacophony of purpose and distraction. I clutched my bag tightly and followed the flow of travelers out into the street, momentarily overwhelmed. A policeman directed me toward Market Street, where I eventually found Wright's Books, a narrow storefront with windows displaying colorful volumes and a sign announcing new shipment of modern novels. My heart beat faster as I pushed open the door, a bell jingling to announce my arrival. The shop was warm and smelled of paper and binding glue. Shelves reached from floor to ceiling with a rolling ladder to access the highest ones. A few customers browsed quietly, and behind the counter stood a woman in her 50s, her gray hair cut fashionably short, her clothes practical but stylish. "May I help you?" she asked, her kind eyes assessing me. "I'm looking for Harriet Wright," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Susan Evans, Celia's friend." Recognition flickered in her eyes. "The runaway bride," she said, too softly for others to hear. "I've been expecting you." Relief washed over me so strongly that my knees nearly buckled. I'd done it, escaped the fate that had killed me once before. Harriet led me through the shop to a back room, then up a narrow staircase to the apartment above. It was small but comfortable, with bookshelves on every wall and a cat sleeping in a patch of sunlight. "You must be exhausted," she said, gesturing for me to sit. "Are you hungry?" I nodded, suddenly aware of how little I'd eaten that day. As Harriet prepared tea and sandwiches, I told her the full story, or at least the version that didn't include dying and being reborn with the ability to hear thoughts. "So instead of becoming Mrs. Thompson today, you're here, starting a new life," Harriet summarized, placing food before me. "That took tremendous courage." "Or foolishness," I said, the enormity of what I'd done finally hitting me. "I have no money, no references, no skills that anyone would pay for." Harriet shook her head. "You're literate, articulate, and determined. Those are valuable qualities. As for references, I can provide those until you establish yourself. You're very kind to a stranger." "Not entirely a stranger. Celia speaks highly of you. Besides, I was almost in your position once, many years ago." She stirred her tea thoughtfully. "My parents arranged a match with a banker nearly twice my age. The night before the wedding, I packed a bag just as you did." "What happened?" Harriet smiled. "I opened this bookshop, built a life on my own terms, never regretted it for a moment." Over the following days, Harriet proved true to her word. She offered me the small spare room in her apartment and put me to work in the bookshop. I learned quickly how to catalog new arrivals, recommend titles to customers, manage the ledger at the end of each day. The work was satisfying in ways I'd never anticipated. Each day brought new books, new ideas, new people whose thoughts revealed their true interests, allowing me to guide them to exactly the right volume. My ability, which had first seemed a strange side effect of my rebirth, became an asset. A week after my arrival, a telegram came from home. I opened it with trembling fingers, half expecting threats or demands for my return. Instead, I found a brief message from Margaret. "Family recovering from shock. Edward engaged to banker's daughter. Your belongings being sent care of Wright's Books. Be well, M." I read it twice, hardly believing the words. They were letting me go. I was truly free. That evening, I wrote to Celia, explaining that I was working for her aunt and inviting her to visit when she moved to Philadelphia. I didn't mention James or Margaret, but I hoped that without my sister's interference, Celia might find happiness of her own. As weeks turned into months, I built a new life for myself. Harriet taught me the business side of bookselling, ordering, accounting, predicting which titles would sell in which seasons. My ability to hear customers' unspoken interests helped the shop thrive, though of course I never revealed the source of my insight. In the evenings, I read voraciously, making up for all the books Edward would have forbidden. I joined a women's discussion group that met in the shop after hours, where we debated politics, literature, and the changing role of women in modern society. For the first time in either of my lives, I felt my mind expanding, my voice strengthening. Celia arrived in October, staying with her aunt while looking for accommodations of her own. She brought news from home. My parents had recovered from the embarrassment of my departure and were now telling anyone who would listen that I was pursuing educational opportunities in Philadelphia. Margaret and James were married as planned, though rumors suggested it wasn't the happy union she'd envisioned. "James seems distracted," Celia reported. "People say he spends more time at his club than at home with Margaret." I felt a twinge of sympathy for my sister, but not regret. She had made her choice, as I had made mine. Winter arrived with biting cold and early darkness, but the bookshop remained warm and bright. Holiday shoppers kept us busy, and I earned a modest bonus that allowed me to rent my own small apartment 2 streets away from the shop. It wasn't much, just a bedroom, tiny kitchen, and shared bathroom down the hall. But it was mine, paid for with money I had earned. On the morning of my 35th birthday, the day I had died in my previous life, I woke with a start, half expecting to feel the weight of pneumonia in my chest. Instead, I breathed easily in my comfortable bed, sunlight filtering through curtains I had chosen myself. I dressed carefully in a blue wool dress I'd purchased with my own money and made my way to the bookshop through snow-dusted streets. Harriet greeted me with a birthday cake at lunchtime, and regular customers offered good wishes throughout the day. That evening, as I locked the shop door, a realization struck me with the force of revelation. I had done it. I had changed my fate entirely. The woman who had died alone and neglected in Edward Thompson's house no longer existed. In her place stood a woman with work she loved, friends who valued her, and a future limited only by her own choices. I had been given a second chance, and I hadn't wasted it. Years passed. The bookshop prospered under our care, eventually expanding to include a small publishing venture for local authors. I advanced from assistant to partner, my name appearing alongside Harriet's on the shop sign. My ability to hear thoughts remained, though I relied on it less as my confidence in my own judgment grew. Occasionally, news reached me of my former life. Edward Thompson's business failed during the Depression, while my father, freed from the Thompson partnership, had pivoted to manufacturing military supplies and weathered the economic crisis successfully. Margaret and James eventually divorced, a scandal, but she emerged from it with enough settlement money to live comfortably. In 1938, nearly 13 years after my escape, Margaret herself appeared at the bookshop one autumn afternoon. I recognized her immediately, though time had changed us both. She was elegantly dressed, her posture perfect as always, but there was a new softness to her expression. "Hello, Susan," she said, her thoughts unusually quiet, as though she was carefully controlling them. "Your shop is lovely." "Thank you," I replied, uncertain of her purpose. "Would you like some tea?" We sat in the back room where I had first met Harriet, the space now converted to a reading room for literary events. Margaret stirred her tea carefully, gathering her thoughts. "I owe you an apology," she finally said, "for everything, for pushing you toward Edward, for thinking only of myself." I studied her face, listening to her thoughts which, for once, aligned perfectly with her words. She was genuinely remorseful. "Why now, after all these years?" I asked. Margaret set down her teacup. "Because I finally understand what you did. It wasn't just running away from a bad marriage, it was running toward something better, something true." She hesitated. "I've done the same, finally. After the divorce, I went to college. I'm teaching now at a girls' school in Boston." Pride and genuine happiness radiated from her thoughts. For the first time since childhood, my sister was living authentically. "I'm happy for you, Margaret," I said, meaning it. "How did you know?" she asked suddenly. "That day you left. You said things about me, about my motives, that no one could have known. It was like you could read my mind." I smiled enigmatically. Let's just say I had clarity in that moment, about the past and the future. We parted that day as something we had never truly been before, friends, or at least friendly. I watched her walk away, her thoughts peaceful, and felt a circle closing. That night, I sat at my desk in my comfortable apartment, now filled with books, art, and mementos of a life well lived. I thought of the frightened bride who had fled before dawn, of the dying woman in Edward Thompson's cold house, of the person I had become in between. The following spring brought an unexpected opportunity. A struggling women's magazine approached our shop about serializing essays on the modern independent woman. Harriet immediately suggested I write them. "Me?" I was stunned. "I'm hardly an authority." "You lived it," she countered. "Your story could help others see possibilities they've never considered." So I began writing, carefully disguising my personal history as a fictional account of a woman who chose independence over security. The series proved unexpectedly popular, generating letters from women across the country. "I never knew there was another way," wrote a young woman from Ohio. "Your story gave me courage to leave my own Edward," wrote another. "I kept every letter, sometimes hearing the thoughts behind the carefully penned words: hope, determination, fear. They fueled my resolve to expand our little corner of liberation." By 1940, Wright's books had evolved into Wright and Evans booksellers and literary salon. We hosted weekly discussions on contemporary literature, providing a space where women could speak freely about ideas often deemed too progressive for polite society. I guided the conversations, occasionally using my ability to draw out thoughts that needed voicing but remained unspoken. The war years brought paper rationing and difficulties, but also a new influx of women entering the workforce. Our shop became a gathering place for these newly independent women, many experiencing economic autonomy for the first time. "My husband would never have allowed me to read this," a factory worker confided, purchasing Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. In her thoughts, "But he's overseas, and I'm discovering I prefer making my own decisions." I smiled, recommending additional titles that might expand her horizons further. In 1945, as soldiers returned and women were pushed back into domestic roles, we established a small foundation providing business loans to women seeking alternatives to marriage or domestic service. The New Chapter Fund operated quietly from our back office, funded by a portion of our profits and donations from a network of like-minded women. "Just because the war's over doesn't mean a woman's independence should be," Harriet declared at our first advisory board meeting. We helped a former munitions worker open a repair shop, a war widow establish a typing service, a young woman from a situation eerily similar to my own escape an arranged marriage to attend college. For each, I listened not just to their spoken words, but to their unvoiced dreams, matching financial support with the mentorship they truly needed. When Harriet passed away in 1948, she left her share of the business to me, along with a letter I've kept close ever since. "My dear Susan, when a frightened young woman arrived at my shop all those years ago, I recognized something in her that I'd seen in my own mirror, the determination to write her own story, regardless of what society prescribed. What neither of us could have predicted was how many chapters that story would contain, or how many other women's stories would intertwine with ours. Continue the work, my friend. There will always be women who need to see that another path is possible." With love and pride, Harriet I honored her wishes, expanding the shop to include a small publishing house specializing in women's writing. We published memoirs, novels, and practical guides, works that larger publishers deemed too domestic or not commercially viable. One autumn day in 1952, as I reviewed manuscripts in my office above the shop, my assistant announced a visitor, a young woman clutching a battered copy of my essay collection, Choosing One's Path. "Miss Evans," she began nervously, "I've come all the way from Minnesota because of your writing." Her thoughts revealed more. "Please let her help me. I can't go back to him." "Sit down," I said gently. "Tell me your story." As she spoke of a controlling father and an arranged marriage to his business partner, I heard the echoes of my own past. I also heard her unspoken determination, the same fire that had propelled me onto that early morning train 27 years earlier. By evening, she had a job in our shop and a room in a boarding house run by another woman we'd helped years before. Another life reclaimed, another story redirected. In 1955, I received a letter with a Boston postmark. Margaret wrote that she was retiring from teaching and had written a memoir about her journey from society daughter to educator. "Would your publishing house consider it?" she asked. "It's not nearly as dramatic as your escape, but it might reach women who make the safer choice first, then find courage later." We published The Late Bloomer the following spring. At the small launch party in our shop, Margaret and I stood side by side, now gray-haired women in our 50s, finally comfortable in our sisterhood. "Did you ever regret not marrying?" she asked as we watched young women eagerly discussing her book. "Having children?" I considered the question seriously. "Sometimes I wondered about the road not taken," I admitted. "But regret? No. I've mothered in my way, through the books we've published, the businesses we've funded, the women we've helped." Margaret nodded, understanding. "You've left your mark more certainly than many who followed the traditional path." In her thoughts, She was always braver than me, but I found my way eventually. I smiled, hearing both her spoken words and unspoken thoughts align in genuine admiration. As the 1960s dawned and younger women began challenging conventions more openly than we ever dared, I found myself regarded as something of an elder stateswoman in Philadelphia's growing feminist circles. Women who had read our books or benefited from our foundation sought my advice on everything from business matters to personal independence. I never revealed my strange ability to hear thoughts, though occasionally a particularly perceptive woman would comment on my uncanny insight. "It's almost like you can read minds," one young activist remarked after I addressed her unasked question. "Just experience," I replied with a smile. "I've heard a lot of unspoken fears in my time. Now, as I approach my 71st birthday, far beyond the age I reached in my first life, I look back on the path that began with that desperate pre-dawn escape. My desk drawers contain 5 published books, correspondence with hundreds of women whose lives touched mine, and the financial records of 73 businesses we helped establish. I had been reborn in more ways than one, not just into a second chance at the same life, but into an entirely new existence forged by my own choices. Edward Thompson had thought I would be his free maid, his possession to command. Instead, I had left first and taken back my future, a future that stretched beyond anything I could have imagined that morning at the train station. In either life, I had never married. But unlike my first existence, this decision had been mine alone, not the consequence of a bad match, but the positive choice to remain independent. I had friends, purpose, work I loved. I had changed not only the ending of my story, but helped countless other women rewrite theirs. The small brass plaque beside our shop door reads, "Every woman deserves to author her own life." It's the truth I return to this world to learn, and the legacy I will leave when I depart it, hopefully many years from now, surrounded by books and the knowledge of lives transformed. I began by saving myself. I will end having helped others save themselves. And in between stretches, a life that was entirely my own creation.